Though we have talked in extensive length about the impact of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima, today I want to focus on the impact concerning one of the most recent nuclear attacks in human history, the bombing on Nagasaki. Now, before I get into some of my anthropological perspectives on how this nuclear attack affected the community of Nagasaki, I think it is helpful to introduce some context about the situation. On August 9th, 1945, not even 3 full days since the attack on Hiroshima, Americans loaded a B-29 airplane with a plutonium bomb, nicknamed Fat Man for its round, fat shape, to drop over the city of Kokura. However, due to poor weather conditions, the pilot was forced to drop the weapon over a secondary target, which happens to be Nagasaki. However, cloudy conditions also made targeting Nagasaki a difficult task, and just as the pilot was about to abort the mission due to low fuel, he caught a glimpse of the city through an opening in the clouds. He dropped the bomb, and 53 seconds later, the entire northern area of Nagasaki was utterly destroyed, with an estimated 35,000 lives killed in the immediate blast. However, in the almost 70 years following the attack, thousands have suffered from ailments and serious illnesses as a result of this incident. It's at this point that I would like to offer some of my commentary about this incident. Now, obviously, as we've talked about in class previously, many of the communities that deal with nuclear weapons, whether as workers or victims, experience higher cancer rates in comparison to the rest of their larger community. However, one of the first pieces of research I came across reflects an almost edict or even removed attitude towards this issue. As an article published by the Genetic Society of America states, quote, "Public perception of the rates of cancer and birth defects among survivors and their children is greatly exaggerated when compared to the reality revealed by comprehensive follow-up studies," unquote. But let's examine what that sentence actually implies. The article details how a study of almost 43,000 survivors only demonstrated that 845 additional cases of cancer could be attributed to the fallout from Nagasaki. And while indeed that is a numerically small percentage, that should not disempower the public perception as this article states. 845 additional cases is still 845 people whose lives were cut short by this attack. Here, we're seeing American institutions attempting to own and control the health effects of the bomb rather than letting the victims of the incident provide the public their perspective and their perception of the events. And it is really unfortunate to see these powerful foreign institutions use their scientific platform to spread rhetoric downplaying the qualitative effects of radiation. And honestly, I find this as an attempt to take away the voice of the Nagasaki residents who still, to this day, have to live with the consequences of this attack. But I digress. Let's focus more on the cultural impact that the bomb had on Nagasaki. Specifically, I want to focus on how Fat Man disrupted 1. The relationship between the government and the people, and 2. How it brought an unprecedented flourishment of American culture into Japan. First, let's address that relationship between the government and the people. The day before the bombing occurred, Sachiko Matsuo, a survivor of the attack, recalls how, quote, "American B-29 bombers dropped leaflets all over the city, warning us that Nagasaki would, quote, fall to ashes on August 8th. The leaflets were confiscated immediately by the Kenpai, or the Imperial Japanese Army," unquote. Now, here is an example of how military censorship presents an example of structural violence on the part of the Japanese government. Though it had a malicious intent to skew the Japanese public's perception of its failing war efforts, it unintentionally put them in harm's way. This structural violence prevented citizens from choosing to leave the city, and as a result, in retrospect, many of the surviving victims harbor resentment towards the government and the soldiers for instructing them to go about their everyday lives in an effort to protect their own reputation and stature. It goes to show how these nuclear weapons have fractured this traditionally collectivistic and cooperative culture into groups based off of domestic political, martial, and economic power. Even beyond the bombing itself, the government unintentionally created a major discrimination issue within Japan. As the speakers from Hiroshima to Hope discussed, the term hibakusha was coined by the government to label the surviving victims who were eligible for special health care. And while that is a benefit, it also created a new race within the Japanese culture. In the Moses reading from earlier this quarter, she talked about how race is a social and cultural construct developed when society accepts a group of people with a common trait the same, whether through consensus or by law. In Japan, hibakusha were alienated from society due to widespread radiophobia, and consequently were unable to enter romantic relationships or find employment. Thus, many were forced into hiding. Still, this continues the trend of how nuclear weapons continue to divide citizens within this collectivistic culture and, unfortunately, created animosity and discrimination between different peoples. On to that second point about American culture flourishing in Nagasaki and in general Japan following the bombing. Part of the terms of surrender Japan agreed upon to end the war created a dependent relationship between the US and Japan, wherein Japan relied on the US for military and political protection. However, as filmmaker Ayanda Osada stated on the NPR podcast Talk of the Nation, quote, Japan looked to America for its culture and its subculture, and children grew up with that sense of dependence as well, unquote. And this is seen in many of the changes in Japanese culture and traditions. For instance, weddings following World War II began to model more of a Christian style, ones you would find in the US, where the bride walks down the aisle in white to her groom. Now, on that note, addressing Nagasaki specifically, a Stanford article points out in the aftermath of the bomb that there was a need to reconstruct many of the buildings that were destroyed. However, this did provide an opportunity for some to build more Christian churches as a result of wanting to look up to American standards, which they did. In doing so, it seems that the nuclear attack also paved way for American and Western culture to become a way bigger part of the culture in Japan. Additionally, looking at the popular culture of Japan, many stories were created through forms such as film and manga to illustrate the horrors of nuclear attacks to a new generation in Japan. As Fedorik explained in her article, popular culture expresses the changing societal values in our everyday lives and can help the masses understand the workings of the world today. Now, take Godzilla, for instance. While it does have entertainment value, there are clear undertones and messages about nuclear attacks being presented. After the awakening from the nuclear tests in the Pacific, the 1954 film depicts the monster Godzilla terrorizing the city of Tokyo. However, artist Takashi Murakami explains that what might be the most terrorizing aspect of this film are the extras in the movie. Notice, he says, how they run from the creature in a frightened state equaling or greater than that of a nuclear attack. It just simply reflects Japan's fears and anxieties about how future attacks, though seemingly impossible, could be scarier than the ones in the past. Another example in popular culture comes from senior curator of the Japan Society, Linda Haugland, who spoke on the aforementioned NPR podcast. Specifically, she addressed how many Japanese films begin with explosions, when in contrast, many American films actually save those big explosions as a grand finale of the film. She explains that this is because the Japanese are the only culture in the world who can truly talk about the aftermath of such incidents, and thus their films are also the only ones which can do so. Again, this is an example of how popular culture and Japanese filmmakers are taking the responsibility of mirroring the commentary and feelings of reality and packaging it for future generations to remember. On the other hand, other cultures with nuclear weapons, such as the US, do not necessarily need to and have the privilege to simply just use radioactive superheroes and big explosions without actually dealing with any fictional or even real consequences. To conclude this vlog, I also want to address some of the awareness surrounding the bombing of Nagasaki specifically. Now, in my research, I found a surprising lack of coverage surrounding this specific bombing. In most cases, it was tied to coverage on Hiroshima, and in fact, many of the articles I ended up finding addressed only Hiroshima. As writer Eleni Saltis best explains, quote, millions of tourists visit Hiroshima each year to see the A-bomb dome, yet while not once going to see Nagasaki. It too is a city, however, that has suffered immensely, unquote. Now going forward, we need to ensure that nuclear tragedies do not occur and do not erase cultural traditions and values. We need to make sure that nuclear weapons do not create fear and anxiety among ordinary citizens across the world. But to end on a more hopeful note, my research helped me discover that many countries are actually taking active steps to do so. 122 countries last year signed the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which promises to prohibit the creation and eventually the elimination of all nuclear weapons across the world. However, none of those 122 countries happen to be states that had nuclear weapons. And to those who do, I would say this. Let's not make the memorials in Nagasaki just a relic of the past. Let it serve as a reminder about how nuclear weapons destroy lives, fracture cultures, and, unfortunately, erase the past. Let it serve as a beacon towards the goal of incremental denuclearization, so that other cultures do not have to face the difficulties people and communities like Nagasaki have faced. And with that, I would like to say thank you so much, Professor Barker and Eugenio and Aaron, for teaching this amazing class. It really did educate me on many of these issues in a very interesting way. And Professor, I hope to take another class with you sometime later in my UW career. Thanks.